What happens when a beloved late-night host comes face-to-face with royal arrogance on live television? In just 39 seconds, one comment would turn a friendly interview into the most shocking meltdown in talk show history. Jimmy Kimmel sat across from Prince Harry, expecting another lighthearted celebrity chat. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement. Nobody could have predicted what was about to unfold. It started innocently enough. Jimmy opened with his signature charm, welcoming Harry to the show with genuine warmth. The prince settled into the guest chair, flashing that familiar smile the cameras loved so much. But something felt different tonight. There was an edge to Harry's demeanor, a tension in his shoulders that the host couldn't quite place. "So, great to have you here," Jimmy said, his voice carrying that easy California friendliness that made millions tune in every night. "I've got to say, we're all excited to hear about your latest projects." Harry nodded, but his expression remained oddly stiff. "Yes, well, I appreciate you having me on your program." The way he said program made it sound like Jimmy was running a public access show out of someone's garage. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, but Jimmy pressed on like the professional he was. "Now, I know you've been working on some really interesting charitable initiatives," Jimmy continued, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Can you tell us about what you've been focusing on lately?" Harry waved his hand dismissively. "Before we get into all that, I think we need to address something more important. The way these American talk shows operate, it's all rather beneath what I'm used to, if I'm being honest." The studio went quiet. You could hear the cameramen adjusting their positions. Jimmy's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered, trying to laugh it off. "Oh, well, we do our best here," Jimmy said, keeping his tone light. "We're just trying to entertain people, give them something to enjoy after a long day." "Entertain," Harry repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. "Is that what you call this? These silly little sketches, the comedy bits. It's all very pedestrian, don't you think?" The audience was dead silent now. This wasn't the playful banter they'd come to expect. This was something else entirely. Jimmy's face remained composed, but anyone who knew him could see the slight tightening around his eyes. "Well, pedestrian or not, millions of people seem to enjoy it," Jimmy replied, his voice steady, but with a new firmness to it. "We've been doing this for quite a while, and we're pretty proud of what we've built here." Harry leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs with an air of superiority that made the whole studio bristle. "I suppose when you're accustomed to excellence, anything less becomes quite glaring. The BBC, now that's proper broadcasting. This American style, it's all flash and no substance." Jimmy nodded slowly, and you could see him making a choice in real time. He could let this slide, keep things moving, get through the interview, or he could stand up for himself, his team, and his show. Being Jimmy Kimmel, there was really only one option. "You know what, Harry? I've got to stop you right there," Jimmy said, his voice still controlled, but with an unmistakable edge. "I've had a lot of guests on this show. Actors, musicians, politicians, even royalty before. And every single one of them has shown respect for what we do here, for the people who work incredibly hard to make this show happen every single night." Harry's eyebrows shot up. Clearly, he wasn't used to being challenged. "I'm simply being honest. Isn't that what Americans claim to value? Honesty? There's honesty. And then there's just being rude," Jimmy shot back. "And right now, you're being rude to me, to my staff, and to everyone in this audience who took time out of their lives to come see this show? Rude." Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm a prince. I think I understand decorum better than a comedian who makes fart jokes for a living." The audience gasped. Someone actually gasped out loud. Jimmy's jaw clenched, and for a moment, the whole studio held its breath. "Okay, here's the thing," Jimmy said, standing up from his desk. "I don't care if you're a prince, a king, Or the Pope himself. When you come on this show, you treat people with respect. That's the baseline. And you've just crossed a line. Harry remained seated, looking almost amused by the confrontation. What are you going to do exactly? Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand the implications of disrespecting me? I understand that you're a guest on my show, Jimmy said, his voice rising now, the anger finally breaking through. And guests who can't show basic human decency don't get to stay guests. This isn't about titles or status. This is about being a decent person. This is absurd, Harry said, finally standing up. I've been interviewed by the most prestigious journalists in the world. I've sat down with Oprah, for crying out loud. And you, a late-night comedian, think you can lecture me about respect? Jimmy walked around his desk, standing face to face with Harry now. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented moment. Yeah, I do, Jimmy said firmly. Because right now, in this moment, on this stage, you're not acting like royalty. You're acting like a spoiled brat who thinks his title gives him permission to treat other people like garbage. Harry's face flushed red. How dare you speak to me this way? I could have gone on any show. I chose to come here, and this is the treatment I receive? You chose to come here and insult everything we do, Jimmy countered. You insulted my work, my team, my audience. What kind of treatment did you expect after that? The prince's voice got louder, more agitated. I'm providing you with ratings, with attention, with prestige by my mere presence. You should be grateful I even considered your little show worthy of my time. That was it. That was the moment. Jimmy's expression changed completely, and everyone in the studio knew something big was about to happen. Get out, Jimmy said, his voice quiet but absolute. Harry blinked, clearly not expecting this turn. Excuse me? I said get out, Jimmy repeated, louder this time. This interview is over. You need to leave my stage. You can't be serious, Harry said, looking around as if waiting for someone to tell him this was all a joke, part of the show. I'm completely serious, Jimmy said, pointing toward the exit. I've never kicked anyone off this show before. Never. But I'm not going to stand here and let you disrespect everyone who makes this show possible. So yeah, you need to leave. Now. Harry's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He clearly couldn't process. What was happening? This is outrageous. Do you have any idea what kind of backlash you're going to face? The media storm? I have connections. Influence. This could ruin you. Jimmy didn't flinch. You know what? I'll take my chances. Because I'd rather deal with whatever storm comes than compromise my integrity and let someone treat my people like dirt. Title or no title. You're making a massive mistake, Harry hissed, his composure completely shattered now. I'll make sure everyone knows about this. I'll tell the world how I was treated here, how disrespectfully I was handled. Good, Jimmy said, crossing his arms. Tell them. Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them how you came on a talk show, insulted the host, the crew, and the audience, and then got asked to leave. I'm sure that'll play really well for you. The security team had quietly moved closer to the stage, ready to intervene if necessary. Harry looked at them, then back at Jimmy, realization finally dawning, that this wasn't going to end the way he wanted. Fine, Harry spat out. I wouldn't want to waste another second in this pathetic excuse for a studio anyway. You're all beneath me. Every single one of you. He ripped off his microphone, the sound making a horrible screech through the speakers. He threw it down on the chair with such force that it bounced onto the floor. The audience sat in stunned silence, watching as the prince stormed toward the exit. But Harry wasn't done. He stopped at the edge of the stage, turning back one more time. You know what your problem is, Jimmy? You're a nobody who got lucky. You make cheap jokes for cheap laughs, and you think that makes you important. But you're not. You're forgettable. Jimmy stood his ground, not rising to the bait. And yet, here you are, on my forgettable show, having a meltdown on national television. Funny how that works. Harry's face contorted with rage. He opened his mouth to say something else, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he turned and marched off the stage, his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The audience didn't know if they should clap, or boo, or just sit there in shock. Jimmy stood at the front of the stage, watching Harry disappear backstage, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then, slowly, one person started clapping. Then another. Then the entire audience erupted in applause, standing up, cheering for their host who had just done something unprecedented. Jimmy turned to face them, and you could see the mix of emotions on his face. Anger, still, disbelief at what had just happened, but also something else. Pride, maybe, or relief that he'd stood up for what was right. He walked back to his desk, ran his hand through his hair, and looked directly into the camera. "Well, that just happened," he said, and despite everything, there was a slight smile on his face. "I want to apologize to everyone who tuned. In expecting a normal show tonight, that was not how I saw this going." The audience was still buzzing, still processing what they'd witnessed. Jimmy took a deep breath, collecting himself. "Look, I don't take pleasure in kicking someone off the show," he continued. "That's not who I am. That's not what we do here. But there's a line, you know? There's a basic level of respect that everyone deserves, whether you're working behind the camera, sitting in the audience, or hosting the show. And when someone crosses that line repeatedly, when they make it clear they have no regard for anyone else, well, then we have a problem." He paused, looking around at his crew, many of whom were still visible at the edges of the stage. "These people right here, my team, they work incredibly hard. They come in every day and pour their hearts into making this show the best it can be. And I'm not going to let anyone, I don't care what their title is, make them feel small or unimportant. Because they're not. They're the reason this show exists." Another round of applause broke out. Jimmy nodded his thanks, clearly moved by the support. "I know there's going to be a lot of talk about this," he said. "People are going to have opinions, hot takes, all of that. And that's fine. But I want to be really clear about something. This wasn't about who he is or where he comes from. This was about behavior. This was about how you treat other human beings. And on that front, tonight was unacceptable." He leaned on his desk, looking tired but resolute. "We've had royalty on this show before. We've had presidents, world leaders, all kinds of important people. And you know what? Most of them have been kind, gracious, wonderful guests. Because being important doesn't mean you get to treat people badly. In fact, I'd argue it means you have an even greater responsibility to treat people well." The audience was hanging on every word now. This wasn't a planned segment, wasn't a rehearsed bit. This was real, raw, and completely unscripted. "So yeah, I kicked him off," Jimmy said simply. "And I'd do it again. Because some things are more important than ratings or having a big name on your show. Some things are more important than avoiding controversy. Like dignity, like respect, like standing up for the people you work with every single day." Someone in the audience shouted, "We love you, Jimmy," and it was met with enthusiastic agreement from the rest of the crowd. Jimmy smiled, genuinely this time. "I love you guys too. Thank you for being here tonight, for witnessing what was probably the strangest moment in this show's history. And hey, at least you've got a story to tell, right? You can tell people you were there the night Prince Harry got kicked off Jimmy Kimmel." The absurdity of it seemed to hit him then, and he let out a genuine laugh. "I mean, did that really just happen? Did I really just do that?" His bandleader, off to the side, called out, "You really did." "Wow," Jimmy said, shaking his head. "Okay then. Well, we still have a show to do. We've got a great musical guest coming up, and I promise the rest of the night will be significantly less dramatic. But first, we need to take a quick break so I can check if I still have a job." He said it as a joke, but there was a hint of real uncertainty in his voice. The audience laughed, but it was mixed with supportive cheers. As they cut to commercial, Jimmy remained at his desk, and the cameras caught him taking a long drink of water, his hands slightly shaking. The adrenaline was clearly wearing off, and the reality of what had just transpired was sinking in. When they came back from break, Jimmy had composed himself again. His tie was straightened, his hair fixed, and that familiar smile was back in place. But something had shifted. There was a new energy in the studio, a sense that everyone had just been part of something significant. "Welcome back," Jimmy said, "and I mean that, sincerely. If you're just joining us, well, you missed quite a bit. The short version is that our scheduled guest and I had a difference of opinion about basic human decency, and that guest is no longer with us tonight." He kept his tone light, but the message was clear. There would be no backing down, no apologizing for what had happened. "Now, I want to pivot to something more positive," Jimmy continued, "because despite that absolutely bizarre situation, we have an amazing show for you tonight. We've got incredible people here who actually want to be here, who respect what we do, and who are going to help us end this show on a high note." The rest of the show proceeded as planned, but there was an electricity in the air that hadn't been there before. Every laugh seemed louder, every applause more enthusiastic. The audience was fully invested now. When the show finally wrapped, Jimmy gave his traditional thank yous. But then he added something extra. "And I want to thank my entire crew," he said, looking around at the people behind the cameras. "You all showed up tonight to do great work, and I hope you know that I've got your backs. Always." The camera pulled back for a wide shot, showing the whole studio, the audience on their feet again, and Jimmy standing at his desk, waving goodbye. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday night talk show. Instead, it became the night that a host chose principle over prestige. The prince had walked onto that stage expecting deference, expecting his title to smooth over any conflict, expecting that his status would shield him from consequence. He'd miscalculated badly, because while Jimmy Kimmel might crack jokes for a living, while he might not have a royal bloodline or a palace, he had something else. He had integrity. He had a team he believed in, and he had the courage to say, enough is enough. What started as a routine celebrity interview had become a masterclass in standing your ground. Harry had pushed, and pushed, assuming his position meant he could say whatever he wanted. Each insult had been another nail in the coffin of what should have been a pleasant conversation. Jimmy had tried to keep things civil, tried to redirect. But there's only so much disrespect a person can absorb, and when that moment came, it wasn't with yelling. It was with calm, firm resolve. The audience had sensed it immediately. They'd gone from excited fans to uncomfortable witnesses to enthusiastic supporters in minutes. They'd watched their host handle an impossible situation with grace and backbone, and Harry had revealed himself completely. The mask of royal composure had slipped away, showing someone who genuinely believed his birth gave him license to treat others as lesser. Jimmy's decision to end the interview wasn't impulsive. It was measured and necessary. He'd given Harry multiple chances to course correct. But the prince had doubled down at every turn. That miscalculation had cost him. Because everyone watching had seen it unfold in real time. There was no editing, no spinning. It was raw and unfiltered. The studio that night had been full of witnesses. People who'd come expecting laughs and entertainment, who'd instead gotten a front row seat to a collision between entitlement and integrity. They'd seen what happens when someone mistakes a platform for permission, when someone confuses an invitation with submission. And they'd seen Jimmy Kimmel, a comedian who'd built his career on humor and heart, draw a line and defend it. Not with cruelty or vindictiveness, but with the simple insistence that everyone in that building deserved to be treated with dignity. The weight of that moment hadn't been lost on anyone present. This wasn't just about one bad interview or one difficult guest. It was about what we accept, what we tolerate, and what we stand against. It was about whether titles and status exempt people from basic standards of human decency. Jimmy had answered that question definitively. They don't. They can't. They shouldn't. And anyone who thinks otherwise, regardless of their position or power, will find themselves on the wrong side of history. Harry had walked in with an air of superiority that set the tone from the very beginning. Even before the camera started rolling, crew members had noticed his dismissive attitude, the way he barely acknowledged people, the subtle signs that this wasn't going to be a typical interview. But Jimmy had approached it with optimism, as he always did. He'd done his homework, prepared questions that he thought would lead to interesting conversation. That excitement had lasted approximately 3 minutes into the actual interview, because once the cameras were rolling, the condescension came pouring out. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. The tone, the body language, the complete lack of awareness that his words were hurtful and inappropriate. When he'd called Jimmy's comedy pedestrian, "you," could see the host's smile freeze. When he'd dismissed American television as inferior, the audience had shifted in their seats. But when he'd made that crack about fart jokes, that's when the temperature in the room really changed. Jimmy had every right to explode at that moment. Most people would have, but instead, he'd stood up calmly, walked around his desk, and addressed the situation with remarkable restraint. That restraint had made his words hit even harder. "I don't care if you're a prince, a king, or the Pope himself," he'd said, because it captured something essential. The idea that no amount of status or power exempts you from basic human decency. Harry's response had been telling. Rather than apologize, he'd escalated. He'd invoked his titles, his connections, his perceived importance, as if any of that mattered when you just insulted a room full of people to their faces. It showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the world works. Jimmy's audience didn't care about titles or bloodlines. They cared about authenticity, about fairness, about watching their host stand up for his team. And when Jimmy had finally said, "Get out," the shock on Harry's face had been genuine. You could see him mentally scrambling, trying to process this unfamiliar experience of facing real consequences for his behavior. The microphone throw had been the final punctuation mark on the whole debacle. That petulant gesture had perfectly encapsulated the entitled mindset that had led to this moment. But even after that, even as he was leaving, Harry couldn't resist one last attempt to wound. That parting shot about Jimmy being a nobody, forgettable, cheap. It had been meant to hurt, to establish some kind of dominance, even in defeat. Instead, it had just made him look smaller. Because Jimmy's response, calm and cutting, had exposed the emptiness of the insult. Harry was the one having a meltdown on national television. The applause that followed his exit had been spontaneous and genuine. The audience hadn't needed to be prompted. They'd stood up because they wanted to, because they'd just witnessed something rare and important. Jimmy's speech afterward had reinforced the rightness of his decision. He hadn't gloated. He'd simply articulated why the interview had ended the way it did. Respect, dignity, the value of the people who make the show possible. For the people in that studio that night, it was real and immediate. They'd come for entertainment and found themselves part of something much more significant, a moment where someone finally said what needed to be said. As the lights dimmed in the studio and the audience filed out, still buzzing with excitement and disbelief, the story was just beginning. But the core of it, the heart of what had happened, was already clear. One man had come expecting to be catered to have his ego stroked, to be treated as special simply because of who he was. Another man had refused to play that game, had insisted on mutual respect as a baseline and had been willing to face consequences rather than compromise. In that clash, character had been revealed on both sides, and the audience, both in the studio and watching at home, had seen exactly who stood where when it mattered most.